Hello, welcome to episode 91 of Retropower Uncut. It's going to be a shorter one this week after last week's behemoth of an episode. It's a short week this week. We're filming on Wednesday because of the Jubilee bank holiday for the next 2 days. I'm going to start with some beer, which is probably much what happened in the beginning of last week's episode actually, although it was more consumption. We've had a very kind chap, Christian Anders, send us a box of beer. Now I'm assuming this was just a gift because there's no covering letter with it, but Stroud Brewery, and I'm assuming I'll report back next week on how nice the beer from Stroud Brewery is. We shall find out. But if anybody else wants to send us free beer, more than welcome. I'm going to start with Land Cruiser engine. So lurking in here, Adam's just working on the V8 at the minute. Excitedly, we've got to the point of heads on, which is always a nice transformation, particularly on a V engine. I think last week we were just talking about the valve clearance setting. We mentioned the fact that it's a solid follower engine, so you have to have shims either purchased or ground the right size to get the valve clearances correct. And basically the process is that we get one shim ground to be known to be too small, and then try that on each follower. Pop the cam in, feeder gauge the gap, and then from that information we can work out what size thickness the shim needs to be, make a list of those, and then actually, because all of the valve seats have been recut, all the shims have got to be smaller than they were originally, so we're just having all of the original shims ground to the thicknesses we need. So they're away being done now, and then that's allowed Adam to then crack on with the next stages, which was getting the water pump on, getting the heads on, and just cracking on with the general rebuild. And as soon as we can get most of the rest of the engine put together, and then just put the shims in and the cams in last and get the belt train built up. So yeah, exciting to see that engine take shape. Unusually, I'm now going to wander outside because we can carry on talking about Land Cruiser. And the door's open, and the door's open because Utah has just left us. So the owner has just come up on the train from London. Very excited for this day, and I think nervous, as we all are. Was always really nervous, nerve-wracking handing over a car. You know, just hoping with relatively minimal testing, when you compare it to like an OEM developed car, that there won't be too many problems. So fingers crossed, he'll be probably on the M1 right now driving home. So yeah, hopefully he'll enjoy the rest of his journey. So I'm sure we'll see it again at the end of its sort of post-shakedown mileage. But for the moment, we are free of Utah. And before anybody says, we are going to do a final episode, and unlike the Murray one so far, we are definitely going to do it, and it probably will be at the owner's house. Moving on to Land Cruiser, I was quite excited actually to see the lower dash section has gone in with the air vents in there, which is like a real big transformation of the interior on that. It's something I've really wanted to see everything come together. I've seen it at the metalwork stage with the vents mocked up, but it's just cool to see it all together with the aircon unit in there, because one of the main things we wanted to try and achieve with this was not having the aircon and heater system look all tacked on, because I've seen a lot of modified ones of these and it always looks like a bit of an afterthought. So we modified the bulkhead to get the vintage air unit quite high up in there, and then deepened the dash to not only give us somewhere to put the vents, but also lower it to cover more of the heater and aircon unit. I think it looks really good, almost like it was designed to be like that from the start. So that's good. We've just had a load of plating back, which Adam's fettling with at the moment. So the door check straps were one of those things. Amongst that plating, we disassembled the check straps and replated all the individual parts. There's a number of other parts, some components of the downlink for the steering, and various other plated parts are back. So it's just slowly chipping away. We're going to do the door builds. I think I showed the latches last week. We deemed that they were okay to be reused without stripping them apart. Various other parts did go off for plating, so really the next step on this is going to be tackling the door builds. And then I can see Jim lurking over here with, I was going to say a welder in hand, but I don't think he has got a welder in hand. He's just doing the rear strengthening brace. So this is MX5 rear subframe. As standard, there's a sort of fairly flimsy looking tubular brace arrangement which goes between the two sides of the wishbone mounts, the lower wishbone mounts, and then extends forward to the chassis. Now we decided not to use the bracing to the chassis because the area of the chassis we've mounted to is so much more substantial looking than on an MX5. But we did think it was probably worth bracing the wishbone mount so they can't kind of move towards each other and flex over time. So Jim's just making a little cross brace arrangement in there, and then that will also pick up on the exhaust. There's an exhaust rubber mount that goes onto that as well. And actually that and then the prop shaft will completely button up all of the running gear on the Morris, so that's pretty cool. Wiring's going in, John's been working on that. The unenviable task of threading the wiring down the sill. Generally routing it all behind the dash. He's been mounting the PDMs as well, so we've got a pair of ECU master PDMs, or PMUs as they call them. We'd already made a basic tray that they mounted to, but we just needed to get the exact positions right and put some little spacers under one of them, I think it was, to raise it up so the connector would go above the engine ECU. It's just insanely tight. The biggest problem on this from the start, or the biggest challenge I should say, was packaging everything. So behind what is essentially a standard Morris dash, albeit extended down a bit, we've got a heating and aircon unit, audio head unit, engine ECU, 2 power distribution modules, all the ductwork for demist vents, dash vents, feet vents. We've got the bias pedal box with the master cylinders inboard to keep them out of the engine bay. There's just so much crammed in. The bonnet release mechanism, even things like that, it gets tight to fit everything in. And then we've got audio, we've got speakers in the footwells as well. It's just very, very tight. So John's just threading the loom, getting all that into place at the minute. He was just pulling the front leg of that through the last thing I saw. So that's that. Rich actually is working on Camaro bits. I'm going to say it as in the way I'm always told I should say it. So with the guys now on the latter stages of prep for paint, we've had the shell together with the front subframe in for the last time that's been necessary for mock-up before painting it. So that signified the point at which we could strip all the front end down, do all the final welding on the sort of upper part of the front subframe that we'd made, and then start preparing everything for powder coat. So a lot of it was bare. The front subframe, all of the rear axle location parts, they were new from a manufacturer in the States, but supplied bare. Some of the parts, like the front wishbones, are powder coated, but because we're going to get everything zinc metal sprayed and powder coated that's bare for anti-corrosion reasons, it makes sense for us to strip these back down and strip them of the powder coat they came with and do our own process on them. So Rich is just pulling the bushes and ball joints out the lower arms at the minute, and then yeah, we're going to have a massive powder coat batch. So hopefully when the Camaro is painted, we'll be able to have all the powder coated parts ready and simply bolt them in, just like I've been saying with the Land Cruiser. So neither of them are going to go smoothly now I've said that. I think actually for the moment in here, that's probably all I've got to cover. So I'll hand over to Nat to show you what's been going on metalwork wise, and I'll see you next week.
Well, hello, and thank you to Cal for handing over to the dark side. So here we are, standing at the back of the Churchill Mk2 Jaguar 2-door coupe project. And Stu has been beavering with sheet metal quite a lot this week. I'll come back to the main sheet metal beavering, because he's currently working on the boot lid. I'm going to sidestep that for a minute. He's got the boot lid, which the original boot lid that came with this car was quite heavily damaged. But we don't need the skin because we're changing that. So he's just de-skinned it. We did a bit of forcible straightening of it earlier by sort of pushing it and sitting on it and things to get the worst of the misshapenness out of it. And he's now de-skinned it, and I think he's going to do a few little repairs to the frame, and then he'll be using the frame to fit up and get the latch mechanism all working without the skin there, so you can reach inside and work with it. It's a lot easier without the skin on, and then we're going to skin that in aluminium, I believe. So that's what's going on right now. Stu's sort of beavering around at the front of the car somewhere. But the major progress this week, and again, bear in mind it's a short week again, so we're currently just after lunchtime on Wednesday, so we're not, he's not had a lot of time on it thus far. Obviously it was started last week, but Stu's been working on the boot floor area. Spare wheel well, which you may recall from previous episode, we wanted a spare wheel to put this, a spare wheel well to put this rather cool aluminium XJS space saver wheel into, which is going to be the spare wheel plan. So he's created that, and we also wanted a battery box for, I can't remember what model battery it is, but a pretty significant battery, so that we've got plenty of power, don't have any problems there. GT type car, always a good idea to have plenty of battery capacity. And then generally, yeah, a lot of metal shaping work. The spare wheel well, to sort of quickly cover how that was made, before you sort of see all of the progress of it. That was made with a flat disc section that Stu's then beaded in the pullmax, or the Pell's nibbler, which is just sort of to my right, just out of camera shot at the minute. He's beaded the sections in that after pre-stretching parts of it in the English wheel, so that because when you put these beads in, obviously they tend to pull, they tend to shrink. In fact, it's not really shrinking, but they gather the material into the beads because there's no stretching done on the top of these beads. So they gather the material, which makes the part distort. So he's pre-wheeled it to try and cancel some of that distortion out. It still distorts quite a bit. That all has to be worked out afterwards. So those circles are pull-maxed in, put in with a reciprocating type machine, i.e. Pell's nibbler. And then round the outside, he's then shrunk the outside in the pneumatic shrinker, and then hammer formed and shrunk that to form the upwards dish around the edge until he's got an upwards return all the way around. Then he's rolled this outer section with a flanged top. He's basically folded a flange onto it, then pushed the flange over, and then rolled that around to form the outside section of the spare wheel. He's then cut that to length to form the joint onto the bottom disc. And he's also then rolled another section for the top to form this Z step, which gives us a recess to put a cover into, to have a flat boot floor and give us a cover over the spare wheel well. And he's cut out the blank for all of the rest of it. Then obviously cut the various sections to fold up this battery box. Then again, using the Pell's nibbler, put the beads into that using the reciprocating machine and a set of dies, which are not in it, so I can show you. The dies for doing that would be these ones here. So those beads in there were created with that set of dies there, which are pretty crude now. They've done a lot of work now, so they're starting to look a bit worn out. They're just made out of a piece of old lathe tool shank. I made them many years ago. So that's beaded that's put the beads into the battery box, obviously all folded up. Spot welded all of that whole boot floor assembly together on the bench. And then plug welded the whole lot into the back of the car, and also plug welded, well, not finished plug welded actually, but partially plug welded this front section in, which, as you recall from last week, has a folded trough at the base of it, which then the boot floor caps off to form a hollow reinforcer section under here, which just gives it the transverse strength there. So yeah, lots of nice fabrication work gone on in there. So at that point, I'll let you see a bit of footage covering that in a bit more detail. So moving on from there, we will head on, thread our way through here, and try and maximise the number of things that Jamie can trip over on the way. We're going to head on over to the body shop, because there's lots of diverse things been going on in here this week. Primarily in front of us is the Jensen CV8, which we've pulled back into the body shop so we can do some more fiberglass work, amongst other things, on. You may recall from the last significant round of body shop work that was done on this, the last round of fiberglass work that you would remember would be that we put the recess into the roof using the tools that we had CNC cut based on scan data. We made a fiberglass return section which was then moulded into the roof to give us the recess for the glass. The next stage is picking up on the work that we were doing prior to that, was making the windows fit without the original type seals. We're converting the car to have bonded in glass instead of the seal type glass. The big fat rubber seals look really ugly, and they're a really obtrusive part that we never really like the look of on these. They just don't really suit the car. So we've decided to go to moulded in glass, but rather than having to have custom glass made, which would be, I mean, it's all pretty expensive, but even more expensive to have custom front and rear screens done. The costs start to get quite eye-watering. So rather than doing that, where we can, i.e. with the front and rear screens instead of the roof, where obviously it has to be custom, on the front and rear screens we're making the apertures smaller basically and revising the shape of the apertures so that the standard size glass can be bonded into them. Talking of the standard size glass, we've had the glass delivery from Euroglass. I think I mentioned that last week. The glass is just in storage at the moment, but we now have the heated, fine wire heated front and fine wire heated rear screens for this. And we will do, after we've done a little bit more work on the apertures, we'll do a trial fit with those to make sure that they are the same as this glass. Who knows, this is very old glass, that's not. Will be interesting to see whether there's any differences, but certainly we're going to be doing a check before we get too far down the line that the glass is the same. At the moment we're going through the somewhat miserable phase, well, a couple of somewhat miserable phases, one of which is trying to determine the exact positioning of the windscreen, which is incredibly difficult because none of the car is symmetrical and the glass isn't symmetrical. So it's quite tricky to get that all very accurate, because finding a centre line through the car, no part of the body shell is symmetrical. So centre lines are quite tricky to establish. And we think with a bit of toing and froing and drawing of lines and rubbing them out and messing around, we've got a pretty good centre line through the screen aperture. And at that point we think we've got a place we can shuffle the screen to where we can get the pillar dimensions pretty even one side to the other, which if you put the screen exactly centred, they're not really. We think we can shuffle all the dimensions backwards and forwards enough that we can get everything to look correct from the front of the car, look reasonably symmetrical from the front of the car, and have the glass actually fit, which is obviously the key. So we're getting close to that. And then also on the Jensen, there's been a couple of other angles of attack. The other part that was done purely in here is that the rear wheel arches, where we modified the rear arches, they were the outer arches which were widened, that necessitated removing and splitting the inner arch liner, which is kind of a part of the fiberglass that actually mounts the rear part of the body to the chassis. It's actually mounted via the rear inner arch onto the sort of inner half of the inner arch, which is the metal, which is in metal and part of the chassis. So where that overlaps and bolts on, we had to split that to get the widening to be able to widen the outer. So that's now been fiberglassed up. That gap where that's been widened has now been fiberglassed up, so that we've got a full width return. There's some filler work to do on that and some tidying work to do on that to get it all smooth and able to have a mould taken off it. But that's now been widened, so we have a complete inner wheel arch now, all in fiberglass. So that's been done in here, and then in tandem with that, Tom's just been finishing off the aluminium door skins that you saw last week being made. He was metal finishing the second of those door skins at the tail end of last week. On Monday this week, he just finished off the last of the slapper tapping up and filing of those of the second door skin. So that's all good. And then alongside that, Gaz has been getting the doors refitted and fiddling around with them because they're awkward. They're very, very tight. They have a really, really tight tolerance between the latch and the striker plate. Sounds obvious, of course, there's a tight tolerance. They latch together, but the catch mechanism actually almost runs into the back of the striker part of the mechanism. It's like a toothed wheel type latch, and the two run incredibly close together, so there's almost no room for manoeuvre on there. And there's also, adjustment isn't very easy because any fore and aft adjustment also tends to lift the door up and down just because of the way the door hinges are designed on this. So it's quite fiddly to get everything lined up properly. And there's so many variables, it just becomes quite a challenging task. The inner door structure on these, very little of the inner door structure actually aligns with the door aperture. It's almost all dependent on the outer skin. And the outer skin, I've probably mentioned this before, but on these, the outer skin isn't just clinched around the door inner like it would be on any other car that you've worked on. It actually clinches either via separate spacing pieces, or with an extra fold in between the actual edge of the aperture and where it clinches round, and is largely riveted or screwed on. So it means that you can't really make any judgment about the alignment of the door from the frame into the aperture, because none of the frame actually corresponds with any of the aperture. That's all purely done by the outer skin. So it's quite a juggling act of tolerances, and we're revising the way, I think I mentioned before, but we're revising the way the door skin attaches to the inner door structure to give us edges that are easier to align with the aperture before the skin goes on. So we're actually putting some extra flanges onto the door frames to give us an alignment position to get the frames aligned before the skins are attached, so that we're not wholly dependent on trying to attach the skins in line. So a bit of a waffle and a sidetrack, but it is extremely difficult to get aligned correctly. Gaz is currently, I think, working on getting the door pillar alignments to the actual door structure somewhere near, because the front edge of the quarter panels is pretty much wherever you put it. One side of the car was crashed, so completely wrong, and the other side of the car was miles out of alignment for some unknown reason, really. The fiberglass just was in the wrong shape to start with. So both of the actual B-pillar front edges have needed to be remade in a new position. So there's quite a lot of work involved in that. So that's what's going on in here. Lots of really, really awkward, unsymmetrical alignment fiddling. So we're making some progress there now, though. And then around the corner, I'll wander around here, but there's not really a lot to show because he's not left them here, but you'll see the Stratos rear clam. George had been working on a new rear light design to go on into the rear clam. Before we do the final fettling and paint of that, we need to make sure that the rear light design is going to fit. So he's come up with a design, 3D printed it and trialled that in there. And he's also been working on the rear top sort of haunch vents, I guess you'd call them, the vents to let the hot air out of the charge cooler rads, which are sort of mounted each side in front of the rear wheel arches. And we've come up with a way of mounting those using a 3D printed part bonded into the clam. He's printed the 3D printed parts, they're bonded into the clam, and he's now coming up with the vent design that's going to screw into those. The frames are effectively bonded in, and then the actual vent then screws into a frame. And he's coming up with the actual vent design, which I'm not sure what the current plan is. Certainly we talked about possibly them being modular and the parts being moulded in carbon fibre and then assembled, then bonded together to suit whichever side of the car they were on. I think that's the current plan still, but I need to speak to George to double check that. But certainly the plan was to do those as a carbon fibre moulded frame, which would be one for each side of the car. They'd be handed, but then the actual fins, the little aerofoil sections within those frames that form the louver could just be sections that were cut to fit, that slotted in and then were bonded in, so that it looked like one piece of carbon fibre. It was actually the fins were not handed, but I don't know whether that is going to be the case or whether they're going to need to be handed for it to work. So watch this space on that one. We'll see where George is at next week on that one, because he's not quite finished that, I don't think, at the moment. And I think That's pretty much, obviously one of the door skins we were talking about is sat there, one of the new aluminium door skins is sat there. So yeah, I think that's pretty much where we're at this week for that. There's quite a lot more work to be done on the doors yet. Some metal work, some fiberglass work, a bit of a mixture of the two. The two have to sort of pretty much go hand in hand. So there'll be a lot more of work between Tom and fiberglass and Gaz and Mark in here, and Steve when he's back next week, on working out fiberglass and getting the door gaps right to the aluminium skins. So yeah, lots to do, all of it quite awkward.
Actually, like a Camaro.
Ah yes, and Mark's just reminded me a very good point. The Camaro is in the paint booth. Is that awaiting epoxy or was that epoxy?
Epoxy primer.
Yeah, is that still awaiting that at the minute,
Yeah.
is it? Yeah, the Camaro's in the paint booth. We're waiting, we've had a bit of a supply delay on the epoxy primer that we use. We use an anti-corrosion Celimix two-part epoxy primer, and we've had a bit of a supply delay on that. Nothing too drastic, but that's why that's not been done. But that's sat in the booth at the minute awaiting the 2K epoxy. Next week should be an epoxy. And then I guess then it'll be Raptor underside, and then it'll be blocking the epoxy on that, and then also getting the panels. Yeah. Cool. Yeah. Ah, yeah. There you go. You heard it here. So yeah, we're getting perilously close to final paint on the Camaro as well. So that's pretty good. Well, I don't think we'll be there next week, but early week after, I would say. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, all.
Chooses the colour.
Oh, we've still not got a colour choice.
Well, no, but he's got to confirm it. He's going to be
right.
speed shape.
Right, okay, yeah, we're just we're in the process of confirming final colour as well. In that, I think we've got a speed shape going or winging its way to our customer, who's going to just confirm the colour over a 3D pattern before we actually commit to putting it on the car. It's always wise to do. So yeah, we've got that going on as well. So it's all going on in the body shop from a bit of a lull. We're actually got a lot of things going, a lot of balls being juggled in the air at the minute. So yeah, lots going on there. And then reversing out, making Jamie's life difficult again, we will pause by another bit of Camaro actually over here, and then I'm going to make Jamie reverse again in a minute. We have this bit, ignore this bit of overspray, that'll all be blasted off once this goes for powder coating. There was some final bits of work to be done on this front tube frame, which is like the inner wing mounting structure basically for the Camaro. There was some finishing work to do on this. Some finish welding, a couple of modifications in terms of how the bonnet pin's attached, and a few other bits and bobs to do on it, which Tom's been doing. He's just he's put some locating structure inside it to keep it all in shape, then finish welded it, then checked some measurements, then taken the structure back out of it again. So that is now, as far as I'm aware, basically ready to go for blast, zinc metal spray and powder coat, which will be going off with a load of the other running gear, the axle casing, the torque reaction arm, the torque arm for the axle, the front wishbones, because we're getting those re-powder coated. We're never really happy with supplier powder coat because they never have metal spray or any sacrificial coating underneath, and it tends to blister. So we're going to get the original powder coat on the suspension arms blasted off and have that redone with zinc metal spray and then powder coat. And the front chassis clip, which I think is somewhere over there, that's also going to all of that. All the Camaro underpinnings parts have all got to go for blast, zinc metal spray and powder coat. So that'll be happening next week as well. So that's why that's there, and that's another thing that Tom has been up to. And then spinning round and making Jamie reverse again, go past my toolbox where I've got the laptop and some drawings, and then the fabrication table where I've just literally trying to fit in. It's been a bit of a busy week because Carol's not been here until today this week, and juggling lots of, there's always a lot of questions and other things to be doing, people to, guidance to be doing. So from my point of view, I haven't really had a lot of time in here, but I've just got these little fixture bits drawn up and CNC plasma cut so that I can fixture up the wishbones, the lower rear wishbones for the IRS on the Escort. So I've just at the sort of early stages, I've just been fish mouthing the tubes for that. This morning, just putting these fish mouths onto the tubes. A little interesting aside actually, there's an interesting thing for anybody doing that sort of stuff at home, how I do that. If I pick a couple of these up, I'll show you. A lot of people have varying types of tube fish mouthing machine. You can buy ones that use a hole saw, you can buy ones that use milling cutters, you can use abrasive wheel type ones where the tube's fed onto an abrasive wheel at an angle, and the abrasive wheel, you can change different diameters according to the tubes. I've used pretty much all of them over the years. I've never used an abrasive wheel one, but I've used pretty much all of the others, and I've got on with them to varying degrees, varying from barely successful to not successful at all. The hole saw ones work really well when you're approaching 90 degrees to the tube. They get progressively less effective the more angle you have. The problem I've found is always that by the time you account for the things that go wrong with a hole saw type tube profiler, you're as quick to just do it with a grinder. You still have to calculate your angles, you still have to do a lot of the sort of pre-work before you do it anyway. And then what you tend to find when doing a big, a shallow angle cut like that is the hole saw has a great tendency to grab and snatch and smash the hole saw. However good your jig is that you're using, it tends to smash the hole saw. I've done it enough times. I've actually made a fixture in the lathe to hold tubes of various diameters on the tool post and have a milling cutter in the chuck and fish mouth the tubes that way. But again, by the time I've faffed about setting it up and getting all the angles set, I find it's as quick to do it this way. What I use and have done for a few years now is there's a great little program. You'll be able to find it on the internet somewhere. There's just a printout, basically. I'll explain how I get this in a sec. Basically, there's a little program floating around on the internet. If you Google it, you'll find it called tubemiter.exe. So an executable file. It's the simplest program ever. It's blooming brilliant. Download it, use it. I believe it's free to download. It certainly was the last time I downloaded it. It's absolutely outstanding. You simply type in the diameter of the tube you are mitering, the diameter of the tube it's got to meet, the wall thickness, and the included angle between the two. And it gives you a little piece to print off. Whatever computer I've ever printed it off from, onto whatever printer I've ever printed it off onto, it's always printed to scale. I've never had it not print to scale. It always prints perfectly to scale. Then you just cut it out with scissors and it gives you the profile, which you wrap around your piece of tube and then mark it out and then cut the piece of tube along that line. And what you'll then find is that once you've marked out your tube using your little paper tube, is that you can almost, on all of the slightly shallower fish mouths, you can do them in 2 cuts on a cold saw. Just chop on the cold saw and then tickle it up with a grinder and you're done. It's so fast once you've done this little piece, and then of course you've got the piece to do all the repeats that are at the same angle. So when I'm doing a roll cage, I tend to just do this and make a series of these series of these little sleeves for the various angles I've got to do, and then use that to mark all my tubes out. And it's blooming brilliant because you can just slide them back up the tube out of the way, check your tube length, work out your overall length from your drawing or from your guide, your bent mock-up templates if you're doing a roll cage, and then simply slide them down the tube to your line, draw around it, slide it off, slide it on the other end, pull it up to your mark, draw around it. You've got your fish mouths on the tube, and then just cut to your lines on a cold saw. And then if it's a long line like that, where you can't get to that acute an angle in the cold saw or your bandsaw or whatever, then you can do it in a vertical bandsaw. So these I've just pushed these through the vertical bandsaw to get the main cut in there, and then tidied it up with a grinder. And you can do a fish mouth like that using that template in under a minute. And it's such a quick and simple, easy way of doing it. So anybody, if you're looking at getting various tube fish mouthing equipment, yes, there are times it's very useful, particularly if you're doing repetitive, close to 90-degree fish mouths, then yes, a tube notcher could be quite useful. But actually, most of the time I find that if you've got a cold saw or a bandsaw or both, and you just download that program and you're happy to print off a few little sleeves, which doesn't take many minutes, then it's much easier. I just find it's easier just to mark them out like that and cut them on a saw, tidy them up with a grinder, and they fit. So just a top tip there is that's how I fish mouth tubes, and I've tried it every other way, and I always have come back to doing it that way. Just as a bit of info. So yeah, so that's what I'm at the moment. I'm not quite there with this one. This one's I've just got the problem on a long one like that is you need to take a lot of the surface out inside there. So I'm still going to take a little bit more of that out to get that one to line up properly. And then I've just got to make 2 little holders to hold these tubes in place on my little fixture on the nice new Mac table. So yeah, so that's where I'm at with that lot. There was something else I was going to just touch upon while I was in this area, but I've forgotten what now. Yeah, I think that's probably it really. I've got a pile of drawings there for parts I've got to bend up, which I was hoping to do this week, but I'm going to run out of week before I get to that stage. But yeah, I've got all the other parts to bend and shape, and I'm going to be setting up quite a few of those on this table to get all the alignments for the welding procedures on there. And I'll be doing quite a lot of TIG welding on it over the next sort of week or so. So yeah, plenty of fabrication to come there. I was kind of hoping I'd be a bit ahead of this stage, but as I say, this week's not been a week of great progress for me because I've been doing lots of other things, juggling lots of other things as well. So yeah, I think that is pretty much where we're at this week at Retropower. So have a good little long weekend, if you're in the UK that is, and yeah, we shall see you in a week's time.